Does it look okay on the screen? Yeah. Okay, cool, because I can't see myself, so which is better that way. I always think it's really important to start from a place of gratitude, and so I want to start with gratitude. And I have a lot of gratitude and appreciation and thanks for the people, the places, the land, and the stories that shape us and that put us on our path and in our place. And some of those people, for me, are here today, and also on the Zoom as well. People who have helped me shape my path, or sometimes put me in my place or on my path in a way that's really important. I'm also really grateful to have this opportunity to share some of what I've been learning to bring it back to communities where it comes from. And I think that's really important, and something that academia doesn't always do very well. And something that I've been really committed to trying to make sure that I do, because without the community work and without those people and places that put me on my path, none of it would exist. And so it's really important for me to bring it back here. And I also just want to share a moment to acknowledge the anniversary of the moment of the attack on Norwich, which was just 2 days ago. All right, so what are we talking about? For some folks, this might be really familiar in some way. For some people, it might not be as familiar. And if my pointer will work, and maybe it's not gonna, it worked a minute ago. There we go. So today I want to talk about different stories of this place. And like I said, I imagine it's a place that's familiar to some of you, if not all. This is the site of a Wapanaki village on the Kennebec River at the confluence of two rivers. It's where the Sandy enters the Kennebec. And this village space isn't just one place. It's also a really important node on a vast network of families, of places, of relationships between waterways. It's a place that's locally in the region, was and is in some ways still very famous. It was made really famous in the 19th century or 1800s. It's in the present-day town of Madison, for folks who don't know, and not to be confused with the neighboring town of Norridgewock, which was named after the village, but they're not located in the same place. And in my hometown, it also has a lot of its own more recent stories. It's a very well-known party place where teenagers used to go and participate in all sorts of shenanigans. But prior to that, it was a community gathering space where people had family reunions, picnics, and people would get together after work, such as working at the paper mill. It's also a place that's really been important to local Catholics for a long time, because of the Jesuit who was there for 32 years and was also killed in the attack. And it's a place where Catholics in the region continue to pray for sainthood for this particular Jesuit. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit. And importantly, it's also part of a growing reclamation and rematriation movement among Indigenous peoples to sort of re-inhabit and enter back into spaces that have always been part of their homelands, but which they had been separated from for a number of reasons over the history of these sort of violent histories. And I imagine that there are people here who carry stories about this place. Some of you have heard stories. Some of you know some stories, and some of you know other stories that might contradict each other. There are a lot of stories about this place. Some of them overlap, some of them don't, and I think that all of them are important. And I want to start a little bit with my own story that Susan's already started to introduce a little bit. So just so you get a sense of what is known locally in Madison as the Pines, and what the Pines looks like. This was taken a few years ago, and it's always changing because they're always cutting things or not cutting things, as the case may be. But as a small child, I used to come here all the time, and you can sort of see right in this space along the river, there used to be a road that you could drive actually down into. And for those of you who are familiar with it might, remember this. But I used to go there with my grandfather in his big old Buick, and or Oldsmobile, depending on the year. And we used to drive down, and he used to bring this sort of the water jugs that look like milk jugs down, and we would fill water from the spring and bring them home. And as we did that, he would tell stories about this place and about how it was, indigenous people's homeland, and how people had lived there, and how evil the English were, and what a problem this Jesuit guy was, right? And these are the stories that I grew up with. The other stories that I grew up with were those stories of teenagers like my mom partying at the Pines. And one of the things that that was really interesting to me as I was doing a lot of work with people when I was studying and trying to learn as much as I could, was that anytime I would mention to folks in my generation, so generations older than me, the parties at the Pines kind of stopped sometime around 1992. And I asked older generations, and they would always mention, oh, we used to party down at the Pines. But my generation, if I asked people about the Pines who were from the Madison area, they would say, oh, my mom used to party at the Pines. But what was really interesting was that those stories about partying at the Pines became less about the place and its history and more about the way that people were working to relate to one another. And I found that kind of interesting. And then the other part of this story that I just want to share briefly, because it becomes important as I dive into some of the deeper things, is the Jesuit missionary. And the Jesuit, Father Sebastian Rall, as we say it in English, Sebastian Rall, there has long been, not anymore, it's now called Madison Anson Days, but it used to be called Father Rall Days. And this was a celebration that started around the bicentennial, around, I think the first one was around 1975 or 76. And it was part of this movement both to acknowledge sort of American national history, but also the relationship between local histories and the national, sort of imagined national connection between the local and American. And so this celebration had both the sort of Catholic relationship to, or imagined relationship to the Jesuit, as well as a sort of celebration of American patriotism. And that was something that went on for quite some time until they changed it to, Madison Anson Days, and it still is a festive time. But for a lot of Catholics are still really connected to Father Rall in a particular kind of way that I grew up knowing, but having my grandfather be really, really mad about. Because he saw, as some people do, saw the Jesuit actually not as a great guy to celebrate, but as a traitor. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. So I grew up hearing this story that my grandfather was not going to go to this parade. How can these people celebrate this guy? He's the reason that people were killed. And he was always really angry about it. And my grandmother, who, if any of you knew Jean Fortin in Madison, know that she was the biggest social butterfly. And she was always trying to get him to go to this parade and go to these events, and he just was not, he wanted nothing to do with it. My mom tells these stories too in her childhood as well. So in high school, all this got started in high school when I decided in American Lit class, we had a sort of a local history literature type project, and I decided I wanted to learn more about this place and about this sort of conflict. And so I took on as a sort of mini project for my class and started looking up, any of the research stuff that you could find for free when you searched online. And I started seeing all these stories about how Rall was this great guy. He was so good to Native people. People loved him. And that just did not jive with what I had learned growing up. And that sort of stuck with me for a long time until I started in much later in college and then in graduate school, really looking a lot more closely and talking to people and talking to descendants of survivors of this attack and learning more about all of these sort of complicated, overlapping and conflicting stories about who's who and what was what. And then to wrap this up real quickly as sort of my own contextualization autobiography here, is when I started graduate school, there was a monument project that was announced at the Pines that the town of Madison was going to create these monuments that were going to tell the story of this place and commemorate the history. And I started thinking, well, commemorate which history? Whose stories are going to be told? Are they working with Native people? I later found out that they weren't. At least not directly at first. That changed a little bit. But and so I started to get a little bit concerned about that. And I was at the Pines with some folks, and this individual, Passamaquoddy Nation from Zibayik, who is a descendant of survivors, said to me, "How could there be so many different stories here? You're in school, you go figure it out." So I did. Not that I figured anything out, but that's what I spent my time in graduate school over the last 10 years really working on trying to understand. All right, so just so that you get a sense of where I'm coming from, the project that I've been working on included historical study in archives. I looked at local histories that were written in the 1800s. I looked at original documents. I spent a lot of time walking and canoeing the land with people who were gracious enough to let me come and to teach me. I spent a lot of time with descendants and other indigenous people and their relations. I spent a lot of time interviewing locals, interviewing officials at the state Historic Preservation Department, combing through old newspapers. And what I share today are, I just want to make sure that everybody understands, there are a lot of stories that people carry that were shared with me, and a lot of stories that people carry that they didn't share with me. The stories that I share today are only the stories that people shared with me, obviously, and that I have permission to share with other people. Because not all stories are stories that were intended to be shared publicly or that were intended to be shared not by the people who have carried them within their own families. And so I just want us to remember that in different cultures, not all knowledge is intended for everyone, and that's okay. And finally, I think that it's very, very important to give people credit for their words and for all that they've given me. But I also believe in privacy, and I don't ever share the names of any individual who spoke with me publicly unless they have given me permission to name them. So I just want to let you know, for instance, an elder from Zibayik, I don't have permission. I have permission to use his words, but I never asked his permission to use his name in a public setting like this one, so I choose not to. Okay, so many of the stories about this place focus on the attack in 1724 and its legacy, and I'm going to get there. But I think it's really important for us to understand this place in a broader context than just the attack. And so I want to back up a little bit to understand the place of the village. And if you recognize the image on the left here, this is a Chiwabanakik, or the Dawn Land, without any of the American, Anglo, and French political boundaries. It shows land and it shows waterways. And on a higher resolution image, it's a really crisp. You can see just how interconnected all these waterways are. And this place is really important in relation to these waterways that connect people, they connect places, land, kinship. This was a gathering place. It was a place that people would pass through on their way to other places and stop and maybe share food, stories, relationships, let people know what was going on. It was a really important planting place where people planted corn and traded corn to places further north where corn wouldn't grow. And it was a really an important place of relationships with people and also with the land itself, right? And also would become a political center and a center of resistance against English encroachment into Wabanaki territory and Wabanaki homeland. And I just want to mention too that the missionaries who were in this area in the late 1600s and early 1700s wrote about how astonished they were about the fish and how many fish there were in the spring when the fish would run. There were so many that the water looked like it was alive with them. And partially, right, we understand today ecologically that this is partially because of the way that indigenous people built important relationships with fish and water that enabled that to be possible. Okay. And one last thing that I want to mention is, a lot of the stories that get told about this place later are about this moment of violence that is that reverberates in people's memories and lives. But I was also reminded one day while walking the land with someone that this wasn't only a place that people died, it was also a place where people lived, where they raised their children, where they laughed. And I thought that was a really important reminder to also remember the vibrancy of these places. And what does it do to our historical perception when we start thinking about both of those things? So I already mentioned that this was a planting place, and I just want to really quickly mention that there's an important story, and I'm not a storyteller, and this isn't my story to tell, but I just want to mention it, that there is this story, creation story, about the Corn Mother, and one of the people who wrote about the Corn Mother from Penobscot Nation, Joseph Nicoller, in 1893. There's a side note that he may have been a descendant from Norridgewock, and that also it's possible that stories like the Corn Mother, well, it's very not possible, stories like the Corn Mother would have been known in these areas. And I mention this because of the way that people's relationship to those deep time stories and those creation stories also connect people to one another and to place over long expanses of time. And there are people on this call, in this room, and on the Zoom who know this much better than I do, and so I don't want to stay there for too long, but I really want us to just note the way that these stories, and some of you who've been here for some of the storytelling may have a sense of that from some of the Wabanaki storytellers, about the way that these stories tell how people are related to the land in some ways that are really, really important. And also how they connect people to each other over time. Okay. So from there, I just want to understand the sort of vibrancy, the deep time relationship that continues, and take us into a little bit of the history. And I'm going to tell this history from a slightly different way than maybe you've heard it before, that this is a place of extremely skilled Wabanaki diplomacy and resistance. There's a long history of indigenous people from this region and from Nanrantsouak who have done a lot of work over generations to try really hard to bring the French and also the English into good diplomatic relationship with them and with the land. Didn't always work out so well. And I spent a lot of time learning about this because, in the sort of American history stories in grade school and whatnot, we learned so much about, about great like colonial men or European and American men, and very little about incredible indigenous leadership. And so those stories painted like a lopsided history picture in my mind, and I knew it was lopsided, so I wanted to better understand. And just really quickly, to give you a couple senses of sort of what's going on, what happens in the north comes out first of really intense tensions in southern, what is now we understand as southern New England. And in King Philip's War and the outcome of King Philip's War, the English actually pushed north and attempted to attack Wabanaki peoples and to disarm them and to try and control them because they were so afraid of what had happened in the south. And they lost. Wabanaki people in this time period worked really hard to defend themselves and their lands and to reset the tables to, to ensure that this was Wabanaki territory, this was Wabanaki homeland, and the English weren't going to encroach. And they also served as really important diplomats in that conflict to then create some better negotiations, as you were. And so what happened after that conflict was, in the Casco Treaty of 1678, the English actually, who wanted to move back up here, had to pay tribute to Wabanaki leaders. A bushel of corn a year per leader, per community. And so this is really important. I also should point out that there's a lot of mention in histories about the Casco Treaty of 1678, but it has mysteriously disappeared. Make of that what you will. The other thing that I want to mention is in another treaty negotiation, this moment of the two brothers and the wigwam with two fires. So in this treaty negotiation, and the treaties, if you don't know, these were multi-day conferences where people were getting together, were discussing the things they were concerned about. The English were trying really hard to say, no, you guys you're submitting to the king. No, we're not. But they're discussing concerns that they have and trying to negotiate and come to some kind of right relations to work together, while also defending their spaces, their families. And so in this moment in 1703, one of these treaty conferences, there's a ritual done of what they call the two brothers, where the two sides come together and rebuild actually these two cairns of rocks that was intended to symbolize that they're restarting their relationships as two brothers that had been damaged before, so they had been destroyed, and so they rebuilt them, and this was an understanding of, as two brothers, we have separate political power, but we also have relation and we have obligations to one another as family. And that was really important. And one of the leaders was claimed to have said that to describe the space as a wigwam, one home with two fires. That is, two political centers, but he makes very clear that the home does not belong to the English. That the English have entered his home. They can have their own fire, their own political power, their own center, their own control, their own autonomy, but they have entered his home, right? And this is really important. And I say his because the speakers that were chosen to work with the English up here were men, but don't let that fool you. Women were involved in these processes, and Native women participated, but not as speakers directly with the English, in part because the English wouldn't speak to women. So I'm going to skip ahead, but I just want us to understand. So in 1713, the English claim all of this land in a treaty with the French, claiming that because they conquered the French in their war, all this land now belonged to the English. And their idea was that, well, it was French land before. And they would fight over that for decades. Because the French would later say, no, this was never our land. We had Jesuits there. We were interested in it, but it was always native land. And the Wabanaki would say over and over and over, we never gave that land to the French. We certainly didn't give it to you, right? And then last, I just want to mention, there's this moment in a treaty conference in 1717 where the governor says that the English will shelter and protect native people within these lands. And the response that this leader, Wawerna, gives is, it sounds however it sounds to you. This place was formerly settled and is now settling at our request. He makes very clear, right? This is our land, and we are willing to welcome the English to resettle these spaces. They're declaring their equal sovereignty and mutual obligations to one another. He says, we will embrace them if they come to settle, but we desire that no further settlements will be made. That is, people can come back to the towns they were already living in, but we don't want them building more towns. We shan't be able to hold them all. And if you think about what it means to hold someone in your bosom, to hold them close, and to care for them, right? This is an idea of to take care to shelter people if there be bad weather and mischief be threatened. Like, we're willing to share obligations to take care of one another, right? But if there are too many people here, we can't handle those mutual obligations. And also, it's not your land. He also declares in that speech that other governors prior to this one had confirmed that they were under no other government but their own. And he refuses blind obligation to the king. We desire that no other settlements be made. And a really interesting thing in this moment, they say, don't build any more forts, because how can you have times of peace if you're building lots more forts? What does a fort symbolize, right, to the English? And he also does something really interesting in this moment and says, we're willing to draw a boundary. We're willing to cut our land off as far as the mills and coast to Pemaquid, but don't come further than that. But they do. And the English continue to encroach into these spaces that Wabanaki people told them not to enter. And in a letter that has, to my knowledge, never been published, that was really hard to read, that I found in the Maine Historical Society, and Minot was a tradesman. He worked at a truck house, which was a trading post. And the folks who worked at the trading post, often Native people would come in and ask them they would dictate letters that they would then write and send. And so, right, when we were at Erasure, we had disputes about your people settling in this country. Your people are building up the Kennebec River. We don't know how far they intend to come. We would like to know how far they intend to come. And we want to know where your boundary is. And so over and over, what I just want to make sure that we understand here is that over and over, Native people in this time period say the same thing, in the sense that, like, this is not your land. We're willing to work together, but, you know, y'all got to stop. And then, but this request to stop, and this is really important, right? We are told that they intend to come as high up as Norridgewock and take from us our planting fields, right? The request for the governor to intervene is never met. In fact, he never responds to this letter. And in 1722, the governor declares war against what they at the time call the Eastern Indians. And he declares war on all of them. And it becomes a moment of really intense kind of mass, all-out warfare. And so despite that, you know, indigenous peoples' assertions toward their rights, their sovereignty, their land remain consistent. Governor Shute declares war because he claims that that Native people have broken the treaty, which they never did. And during this time period, in part because of the power of the leadership at Nanrantsouak, and also because of the Jesuit, because the English didn't want to take responsibility for their part in this war. They wanted to blame the Jesuit. Oh, it's the Jesuits have caused this uprising. The Jesuits have created trouble. So they declare war on the whole region, but Nanrantsouak becomes a specific target. And they actually, during this particular war, attacked the village 4 times. And the most famous of which is the August attack, which was led by Harmon and Moulton. And this was a really brutal attack. This is a sort of a famous image of it that was created much later. This was created in 1855. But this is an attack that's known locally as the Norwalk Massacre. This was a moment of sort of unimaginable, unspeakable violence where the English aren't just fighting combatants, they attack non-combatants. And they kill a lot of people that day. So there are many stories about what happened on that day. And in the history books, the stories tend to focus on the Jesuit. And I'll talk more about that later if someone is interested, why it focuses on the Jesuit. So I've been telling this version, if you will, of this history, focusing on Indigenous leadership, on diplomacy, on power, because it's really easy to focus on the violence. The violence is what everybody knows. It's important. But what I hadn't grown up learning about was Wabanaki resistance, strategy, inventiveness, humor, strength. That was often left out of the histories that were told by non-natives and non-native historians. And so I wanted to sort of bring that into the way the story was told and to try and give a more clear picture of how we got here. So a few years ago, I was invited to share some of my work at Maine Wabanaki Reach Gathering, an educational event, and to talk about this place and its meaning. And I shared this sort of approach. I knew many of the people in the audience who were Indigenous, who knew the stories of the battle, who knew more than I did. And I had learned so much about how hard Native ancestors had fought for their people that I wanted to share that version of the story. So that's how I told the story. And at the end of my presentation, there was an elder in the back, and unfortunately, I don't know who she was. But she stood up and she said to me, "What do you know about the church?" And then she said, "There's a story that people died in the church. Do you know this story?" And that moment really struck me. And again, I mentioned at the beginning that there are people who put you in your place. And that was a moment where this woman had put me in my place. And I will be forever grateful to her. Because it struck me that I had downplayed the violent moment of this attack too much. And trying to focus on resistance and resilience, which is really important. We need that part of the story. But I had left out one of the most important parts of this place to people. And that's how it is remembered. And how it continues to impact people to this day. And she called me on it. So now in all of my work, I always ask, what do you know or what do you think you know of anything and everything I encounter? And I hope that you will too. So what follows are some stories about violence. And so I just want you to know, these are stories about violence told from some of the Wabanaki perspectives of stories of this attack. They're all stories, again, that either were published and intended for an audience or I have express permission to share. And there are, as I mentioned, stories that I don't know and stories that I don't have permission to share that aren't included here. And I also want to share that some of the stories are stories that I have either read or have been explained to me. And my grandfather did tell a burning church story, but I didn't learn these stories in a traditional Wabanaki context of storytelling. And so for those of you who did and who do, right, there's more to the stories than I will ever understand. And you bring those with you as as I share some of this. And I'm forever grateful for all that you carry. So any insights that I have here, I just want to say, are entirely thanks to Wabanaki people. And any mistakes or misinterpretations are entirely my own. So this comes from a collection of stories by a man from Tobic First Nation, Charles Laporte. And he says, so now I'll tell you the story as it has been told among us of Norridgewock when they were all killed, where the Indians were all killed after the priest sold out the Indians. And Tobic First Nation, if you don't know, is a Maliseet community in New Brunswick. Okay. So in this version of the story, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say version. In this story, in Laporte's story, the priest tells the villagers that they should all meet in the church for confession and communion. He instructs them not to bring any weapons with them. Most of the community attends, except for a young girl who stays home to care for a newborn whose parents go to church. While everyone is gathered together in prayer, the priest pulls out a handkerchief and signals with it, and the English soldiers who have been hiding surround the church and begin to shoot into it. The soldiers also shoot anyone who attempts to escape through the windows while they pile wood around the outside. They light the church ablaze with people who are trapped inside. The young girl who had been caring for the baby escapes and witnesses the church burning from afar. All of the other villagers die. The girl then travels for 9 days until she makes it to Maliseet country, bringing with her the memory of Nanrantsouak, and she's later counted among Maliseet ancestors. So in this way, right, she ties that community to Norwich in stories, in memory, and in her relationships, and in the descendants there. So in a lot of the stories that I've come across, there's lots of different stories, and they're told from different perspectives, but they all share certain themes and images, one of which is this burning church image. There's also stories about prophecy, about the priest, and about the traveling survivor. And I'm not going to talk about all of them now, but all of these encode experiences and memories of violence at the hands of Europeans, and this is really important. So again, one is the burning church story. I also heard this story from Donald Soktoma. And another story of this sort, and from many other community members. And they also tell about how people came back to care for the people who had died afterwards. And so it's really important, I think, for us to understand the ways that this moment in history is remembered as this sort of unspeakable violence, right? It's very different from other types of sort of fighting and warfare between combatants, which is itself, right, really violent, but this moment is remembered in a different way. Okay. But I also want to talk about how every single story that I've come across has at least one person who survives, like the little girl. Many of these stories tell, sorry, I skipped over by mistake. And this was a story told by a Wabanaki Abenaki man from what is now Quebec. When they had gathered in the church, the English attacked, and an old woman was the only one to escape in this story. She takes her grandchild on a cradle board, swims the Kennebec River, and the rest of the people were killed. And that old woman in that story goes to Penobscot Nation, where the baby in the cradle board becomes a really important historical figure there. And of course, there is the most famous half-armed Nicola, who escapes and also heads to Penobscot Nation with, he's said to have carried the bell from the church and stashed it somewhere. So these traveling survivors, now we have a story about someone who goes to the Penobscot River. We have a story about someone who goes to Maliseet country. And this is really important in part because the English and American stories of this place, sometimes there are survivors, but most of the time there aren't. The story that gets told is that this is the end of all the Norridgewock people by the American stories. And I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. Here it is. In the 19th century, the 1800s, the way the English or Americans at this time tell this story is an end story. Right? Thus ended the proud Norridgewock tribe. Although it was not entirely obliterated from the earth, it passed out from its place. The Norridgewocks never recovered from the effects of this blow. But also, so I'm going to talk about the meaning of these sort of contrasts in a moment, but also none of this is true. The last of the what? So just so that you know, as a quick aside, Norridgewock leadership was present at the end of the war and in 1727 participated in the Falmouth Treaty that ended the war. In 1726, they didn't show up because probably they didn't want to deal with the English at that moment. And so in 1726, they don't show up, and the governor of Massachusetts Bay is so upset by this that he says they can't hold the conference, and they have to reschedule it for the next summer when the ships can come back because the Norridgewocks have to be there. People lived there again for a little while. They were in and out. There was a Jesuit there, multiple Jesuits, but until the 1750s. Norridgewock people continued to negotiate treaties until at least 1753. And Massachusetts actually declared war on them again in 1755. And a leader who was said to be a Norridgewock leader was murdered, and actually down in what is now Winslow in 1765. And there was there was investigation maybe about it, at least in the documents. And I also want to point out, for those of you who are familiar with American history, sort of American Revolutionary War history, I mean, is that Benedict Arnold, on his ill-fated march to Quebec, which I might talk about, stopped by there and talked about how people had been living there up until about 10 years prior to when he was there in 1775. And in fact, he writes about how there are people writes about how the land is kept, how it was cleared, they were able to camp there for 6 days. There were obviously people coming and going from this space, and I think that's really important. And also I want to mention, Arnold wouldn't have made it without his indigenous guides. He was traveling to Quebec. It was a disaster, but he was traveling to Quebec using a map that was created by a man who was brought through an area that he had never seen before. His name was Montresor. He had 2 native guides from the region who brought him through, and he made the map. The problem was, while the native guides knew exactly where they were, they knew the land very, very well, it was their homeland, Montresor had no idea where he was. So he made this map, but it became quite useless, and this is why Benedict Arnold and his men get completely lost. It's a complete and utter disaster. And also because he doesn't want to listen to the native guides that he has. And as he's traveling to Quebec, he also has, some of the men write that there are native people who are following them with painted faces, who are probably trying to figure out what the heck these men who are armed are up to in native territory. And at the point where they get to Norridgewock Village and they sleep there for 6 days, they actually hire those men to come help move the whaleboats over the falls because they had too much stuff. I find this story hilarious. And as they're traveling north, they also come across a very well-known leader from Norridgewock. His name was Natanis, who later moves to Penobscot territory. So if we know, and the documentary history knows, and Arnold's experience is that there are Native people still in this area, where's this story that all the Native people were gone or extinct after this attack come from among the English and the Americans, right? I want to be really specific. This is a story among the English and Americans. And it really comes, I never thought I would pinpoint it. I actually pinpointed it. It comes from this fascination with an imagined indigenous past early in American literature in the 1820s and the 1830s. And it starts in part with the well-known poet, John Greenleaf Whittier. It's most well-known, right, for poetry in the Civil War era, or around the Civil War abolition. But he has an earlier work from 1830 called The Legends of New England. If you want to think about the symbolism of this, the last poem in this book is called The Last Norridgewock. And in the poem, it's autumn. If you want to think about in American literature, we have, my high school English teacher is here. In American literature, right, autumn and symbolizes all the things that autumn, winter is coming, right? He tells this story of this Native woman who he calls the last Norridgewock, who is who's sitting there as the sun is setting, thinking about her people who have all died, and she herself then dies, right? And so we have a poet who imagines and creates in fiction, right, this end moment, the last of. And we've all heard it before. It's a very famous storytelling from this time period. We have the last of the Mohegans and the last of everybody. And there's another part of the poem too, where while we do have this woman, he also writes about how Native people have been gone so long that you can't even find their stuff anymore. And so in this story, Americans then are trying to push indigenous people further and further back into the past, in a way perhaps not to have to reckon with the very recent history of violence that Americans themselves were a big part of. The other piece here is, there's another poem called Magamigon, which confuses different Native leaders in different time periods, but focuses on Norridgewock. And then most famous in this region, but that hasn't continued to be famous into the present, is this play, Carabasset, by Nathaniel Deering, who lived right here in Skowhegan, right? And this play was probably written here in Skowhegan. And Nathaniel Deering answered a contest for an American play with an American protagonist, and by American at the time they meant a Native person, historical protagonist. And in this play, Carabasset, it's the end of the Norridgewock story. The leaders at the end of the play, so it tells the story, it sort of tells a story of Norridgewock and the attack on Norridgewock and this violence. But at the end of the story, everybody dies except for a few leaders. And the leaders tell the audience how all their people have died and they no longer have a home. And everyone else dies. And then Carabasset, the main character in the play, actually the main character in the play was Jesuit Father Rawl, but well, you know, we've seen that before. Carabasset lives through the attack, and he was a leader at Norwich. He's actually a historic leader. He lives through the attack only to get his revenge on the person who killed, I can't remember if it was a woman in his life. I can't remember if it was his sister or daughter or wife. but then commits suicide in the play. And so you get this story in American fiction, in local American fiction. This story becomes so popular in Skowhegan, and then they ask, even though it doesn't win the contest, they ask him to perform it in Portland. But what does it do? It sparks a new local interest in this story, in the story of Norridgewock and the history. And so a whole bunch of local historians who are sort of taking up the work of writing local history anyway. They're taking up the work, Maine becomes a state in 1820, so they need to write local histories of towns. They need to write the history of the state of Maine. They're writing the history of America after the American Revolutionary War. Locals get really interested in this story, and they start writing a history of the Norridgewock people without any input from Indigenous people. And what do they cite? They cite the poem in the play as if they were historical documents, right? And those people didn't do much historical research, right? So my point here is that even these stories that have become really popular, that look like histories, right, are not even based on even the English's own documentation. And so we have to understand the way that those things have shaped how we think about this place, and how American history has thought about this place. And so I've been talking for a really long time, so I want to jump ahead really quick and wrap this up. But there's other sets of stories. I mentioned the local stories in Partying at the Pines, and how those stories then become not about an American nationalism, but also about what it means to be from Madison. And they also entail this other piece, which is a story about collecting things at the Pines or along the river, collecting things that belonged to Native people who lived there. And so when I asked folks in Madison when I was doing this work, I was gathering stories, I asked people what they remembered about the Pines in Madison. And one of the stories I kept hearing over and over from people was about collecting things. We used to find arrowheads. We used to find this thing. We used to find that thing. And it's really important in that it builds relationships with people, but it also, what I was finding was it has a tendency to reinforce some of those erasure narratives, because the other things that they would say, oh, you can't do that anymore, or you can't find them anymore. And much like that poem, it pushed people further back into the past than they actually were, because as we all know, Indigenous people, Wabanaki people have continued to have a relationship with this place. And so those stories create, for a lot of people in this region, a lot of non-Native people in this region, a sort of cognitive dissonance, right? Between that well-known embodied erasure story, right, that we've heard over generations, and the reality of Indigenous continuity and Wabanaki relationships to these places that have continued, right? And that has a legacy that continues, sometimes something that we can work through, sometimes it continues as another form of violence. And it has real impacts, I think, for our relationships with one another, right? And we've seen that with some of the politics about who gets to decide what words we use where, as if Indigenous people are gone, and we know that they're not. So it has real impacts and to our relationships, and that's something that I think, we have work to do, right? And it also impacts projects that are done even when the projects have really good intentions, like a memorial. I mentioned that my research started because of a monument project. So this monument project, which had some really great intentions, does a couple of things that reinforces or potentially could reinforce some of those erasure narratives that I wanted to think about, how that legacy continues even as we're trying to undermine it. So this is a story that tells a history of the village site over 6,000 years in a very small blurb. And at the bottom, we see we do see an acknowledgement of survivors, but of survivors that went to Canada. That's another story you see a lot in the stories that were written in the 1800s, the 1830s and 40s, was that the survivors all went to Canada, which in 1724, when there isn't a boundary, is a neat trick, right? And I just want to make sure that we understand that this was a horribly violent moment, and I'm not downplaying that at all. Survivors, many of them did relocate, but they never left their own homelands. And the English then tell the story of movement as if it's the story of the end. And I think it's really important for us to think about how that worked out. The other thing that I want to point out is you see this size of this monument. I said this is 6,000 years of Wabanaki history. This here is the same size. These are the two big monuments that are there now. This one is the same size, looks roughly the same. This covers 6 days of American history. Make of that what you will. The other thing that the monuments do, I mentioned, Benedict Arnold had mentioned the sort of recent presence of Native people here. And because he writes in his journal that people had been living there, even 10 years prior, the quote on the monument truncates it. So it just reads, here's a small vestige left of an Indian town, the foundation of a church and altar, which makes it read like a ruin as opposed to a place that had been fairly recently lived in, right? So it changes the story. And that becomes really important because historians, even though Arnold was talking about a place that had been recently and actually was still lived in at the time, have reinterpreted it to mean ruins and absence. And in response to this, in a letter that the Penobscot Cultural Preservation Director, Bonnie Newsom, wrote to the town of Madison at the time in 2010, sort of called them out, right, on this, what they call the vanishing Indian mythology, is that we need to put an end to it. The local public is continually perpetuating through these historical monumentalizing activities and projects. And so the question, right, I want to wrap up with a bunch of questions here. What does all this mean for when we're thinking about our own received stories, whatever those stories might be? Or when we're reading American history from whatever perspective we're reading it from? What are the lenses we might be using to make sense of it without even realizing are there, right? Some of these are what we might call received narratives, things that we've heard and they're kind of unconscious now, right? So, for example, the embedded erasure, there are many people who have taken it for granted so much that have taken for granted that this place was abandoned or erased, that then when they encounter, right, the reality of Indigenous presence, continuity, or reclamation, they have to figure out how to explain it, right? Except that it's always been there, right? So the question is, what can we do differently? And in my own history work and writing, I try to sort of flip that narrative. So what if instead of starting from the assumption of erasure, of absence, I start from Indigenous presence. I know Indigenous people, this is Indigenous land, Indigenous people are present. And I take that for granted as the starting assumption. And when I do that and I start to look at stories and histories in different places, and when I was in the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts, similarly, looking at stories and saying, okay, I'm gonna assume that Indigenous people were always here, they never left. So what is this, where did the story that says that they left come from? How did we get there? And that gets us seeing things in a different way, right? And maybe I wonder then what can happen if we start, rather than some of us spend a lot of time questioning, interrogating. If a Native person says they've always been here, we think we know that they haven't. So then we have to make them prove it, right? What if we didn't do that? right? So these are sort of questions. Then the question becomes, if the story was told that way, who told it that way and why? And I just want to leave you with this last image to think about those Wabanaki stories and the traveling survivors. And I mentioned people have moved through their own homelands and carried the story with them and the memory and the relationship, and this is really important. So here in the arrow, in my very poorly drawn arrows on this map, is roughly where Norridgewock is. And here is all the places where I found Indigenous people who had the stories of Norwalk. And I know this isn't anywhere near all of them, right? So what I sort of see, or what I understand here is that, Norwalk experienced this horrendous violence, but it never went away. It's everywhere, right? In Wabanaki homelands. And that's really important. And this has sort of pushed, we're seeing relationships to one another and relationships being rekindled, and we're seeing that now. And I just want to put a plug out there for the incredible people, young people, women who are doing a lot of work in the Kennebec River Valley to reclaim, rekindle, build relationships with the land there, and mention the Bomazeen Land Trust, which is a group of intertribal group of young people who are spending a lot of time in this area, are building relationships with people, are doing educational outreach, and are taking land back into Wabanaki hands and doing some amazing planting and other sorts of work. And I think that that's really important and really powerful, and that, it's in really good hands. And so check it out, see what they're up to, and support them. And thank you in 4 languages. Yes, let me. Oh, goodness. I see a couple of quick questions. The date of the plague care Bassett, I want to say, my brain transfixes numbers. So it's either 1823 or 1832. Someone says 1830. Thanks, Jeremy. They were around the same time period. I don't know where I got 32 from. All right, did I see?
Not be accurate. I just checked Google with no time to.
Hey, and I think it's really important to. One of the things that I learned, now that you're saying that, is such great resources. So many amazing historical resources online for free. You can find a lot of history information things if you search like archive.org and all of these things. But what are you going to find there? These are histories that are no longer in copyright. So what are they? They're the histories from the 19th century, right? Those are the histories that are available for free online. And they're really helpful if you know how to read them critically, right? But if we often think about history as sort of, or many people, maybe not everyone, right? But many people think about history as a sort of, these are the facts. This is just what happened. But it's so much more complicated than that. It's so political. And, the storytellers that we call historians in the 1800s were really involved in the work of, creating local non-native places, creating local non-native histories, creating local non-native America. And so, they had, the stakes were high for telling the story in a way that conveniently removed what they might have seen at the time as the problem of ongoing Indigenous place, right, and sovereignty, which was still there, right? And I just want to mention this part of the Kennebec River has never been ceded. It was never ceded. The English claimed that they got it from France, but France never owned it. So it has never been ceded. So that's, what do we make of that? I don't know. I've seen lots of hands. I had this one first. I'll come back to you.
How were the Mohawks, what role did the Mohawks play, and how did the English recruit them?
Someone who knows their stories. Wonderful, thank you. So the question is, what about the Mohawks? So if you don't know, there were 3 Mohawk scouts working for Harmon and Moulton during the attack. It's a really complicated story. In this time period, and it's not very fresh in my memory, so I apologize if I get some of these details a little bit confuddled. But we do know a little bit about those 3. I don't remember their names, but I have them somewhere. One of his family members was being held, right? So he was hired, we might say at gunpoint today, right? But also, things were really, the Mohawk people in this time period were and are amazing diplomats, fighting for their own people. But also, like many people people are being fractured by religion. And so you also have people who are being converted or partially converted to Catholicism, being converted to other Christian, right? And so there are tensions within communities as well as between them. And some of the people who ended up serving as scouts for the English had been people who had been living in some of those Christian communities. I can't remember the specifics about those 3 scouts, but I will say it's really complicated. And this is also a time period where the Confederacy, if I'm remembering this right, the Confederacy of the Haudenosaunee had sort of been put a bit on pause because there was so much violence. And so, yeah, it's really challenging, but it's a really great question. I think another story that I had heard that I think is really important to acknowledge here is that an oral story that my grandfather had, but that I also learned from other people. Now, not everybody carries it, but that's that Raleigh himself wasn't killed by the English. He was killed by the Mohawks, who were their scouts, because they saw him as a traitor. And the reason that this story, what I understand, I had a conversation with a Ganiat Gahaga, or Mohawk woman from Guanawage, because his body had been filled with dirt. So they had put mud in his mouth and in his ears, and they had covered his eyes. And that's how his body had been found. And there is a ceremony among the Haudenosaunee where you clear your ears and your mouth so that you speak with truth. And the idea is this conversation that I had with this woman. She's a scholar as well at Carleton University, and she was talking about how she could imagine potentially that as the reverse of that, as a warning. This man couldn't be trusted. He did not speak with truth, right? And so, you had people in this time period too. There were indigenous people who may have been politically at odds, but may have had family relationships to one another. And so they're in this complicated moment. And so they may have been fighting, but also had familial obligations that said, this guy is bad news, we better warn people. Really complicated and not as easy as what we often like to say, well, the Mohawks and the so-and-so were enemies. And sometimes they absolutely were, right? But it also, it gets complex.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I have a question in the back.
Yeah, thanks for explaining these stories. I was just wondering if you could repeat the name of the local group that's doing reclamation work.
Yeah, the Bomazene Land Trust.
How do you spell it?
Yes. and someone wrote it for me. I already know. And so Boumediene, it was one of the leaders and diplomats through all of from Norridgewock. He's actually from slightly downriver, but was one of the leaders of the sort of regional part of this part of the Kennebec. And he negotiated some of these treaties, and he's kind of a hero in my eyes because he was a total thorn in the side of the English, and like a really interesting individual. I can look it up, but I believe they spell it because it's spelled a lot of different ways in the histories. But Bomazen. And it's like BoumedieneLandTrust.org or something. Yeah.
I'm just curious, locally, that the story is Ryle lived with these people for a number of years, worked on a dictionary.
Yeah.
One would assume befriended them. Is that true? Is that slanted? He certainly wasn't British.
Great. Yeah. Super complicated. So who is this Rall guy? Yeah, so Father Rall was a Jesuit missionary who lived at Norwich for about 32 years. And when he died, he was a very old man. And when he died, he was not only a very old man, but he was severely disabled because several years prior, he had fallen. I can't remember what he was doing. And he had broken a number of bones in his legs, and they never healed right. Really complicated individual. So he's born in France, and in Canada, in Nouvelle France, they had Jesuit missionaries who were coming centered in France, but their whole mission was to bring Catholicism to Native people. And they did it not in the way that the English Protestants did. The English Protestants who sort of like forced people into these communities, stripped them of everything, and didn't let them, like literally did not let them leave what they called the praying towns. But in New France and what they called the Pays d'Anneau, which was the Great Lakes region, right? Jesuits would go and live amongst communities and try to bring them the word of Catholicism and bring them. And they also, in that process, would undermine the power and the political power and the relationships that people had also with the traditional medicine people and spiritual people. They would call them tricksters. They would call them cheats. They would call them liars. And so they created a lot of tension among communities and within communities. But they were also people who lived in the community, right? So you have this really complicated relationship that people have because they are living with you. You're taking care of each other. You have obligations to one another. You're making sure, as good hosts, you're making sure that this person from France who does not know how to fish, right, gets fed, does not know how to live in this place, right, gets fed, gets taken care of. At the same time as, right, the Jesuits they're complicated in this time period too because New France is attempting to use them as pawns, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So who was Rall? He was from France. His first assignment, he'd come down the Kennebec really early in his first assignment, but then was sent back to Quebec and then was sent out to Illinois, actually. And really interestingly, I was studying in a research library in Chicago and I came across some of his stuff. And I was like, wait a second. But it's like, here's the Kennebec, like, following me to Chicago. But he was there, and he was also, then he was sent back, and he was living among the Norridgewock for 32 years after that. So yeah, somebody who had meaningful relationships with people, somebody who was probably disliked by people who had other, right, spiritual relationships that he was trying to undermine because they were not Catholic. They were heresy to him. Maybe he was up to no good. I don't know. It's really complicated. And did I just lose the... I just lost the Zoom.
You're frozen on my screen. You could,
It just crashed. I got to reopen it, but I saw another question.
oh, I see that.
Oh, it wants me to join a meeting. Please hold. Restart, retry. We'll see if it comes back.
It looks like you still have audio. Okay, here we go. And there was a question in the chat while hopefully getting back in, asking if the town of Madison ever responded to Bonnie Euston's letter about the vanishing of the
Oh. Thanks, y'all. So, the way that the director, so I interviewed the director of the program who designed the monuments, or who didn't design them, but who was the head of the project to create the monuments. And what that person said was that, this letter came, and the town manager sort of walked into her office and dropped it on her desk, like, "You've made the Native people mad." And this is how she tells the story. I don't know what he said, but it just struck me as this, like, oh gosh, it's like sort of disrespectful kind of space. But, so sort of, in a way, they tried, but it was after the fact, right? So a lot of the project had already been underway. They did eventually reach out to Bonnie and Donald Soktoma, who, if you don't know, is the tribal historian for Passamaquoddy Nation at Magamigon, or Indian Township. And they came and they went to the site with her, and they tried to show or talk about other ways that people have related to this place. For Wabanaki people have always related to this place, that there are descendants, that it's really important that they be respectful of descendants. And so if you go there, what I read knowing all of that is this kind of back and forth. You see bits and pieces of sort of descendants and that, but you still see the erasure narrative, because again, it's so ingrained and embedded. And also, again, if you read those histories, local histories from the 19th century, that's how the story is told, as if it's just the truth. And so if those are all your sources, as well as archaeology, without a lot of engagement. And so one of the things I've been working on is thinking about, okay, maybe it's not enough. What does it mean to include, in this case, Native voices? If the way that you've structured the story, right, already imagines the abandonment or erasure, and so then what are you including people into? And I think that's kind of what happened, because it was already there, and then we tried to include. And by we, I mean the town of Madison. I wasn't involved, but, right? But what might have been different if it started as a collaboration to begin with, right? What kind of project might there have been, right? And maybe that's not the kind of project that people wanted to put their time and energy into, People have a lot going on, right? There's this amazing land back movement. People have things that they need to work on that might be more pressing, but there might have been people who are interested. I don't know. But what would that have looked like? And if descendants weren't interested or didn't think that a commemoration or memorial like that, what does that then mean? Is it the best thing? I don't know, right? So something to really think about, like, what does it mean to include into a story that's sort of not taking into account, right, other perspectives and ways of relating to this past and this place?
I think there's always been the unknown about the ponds, the truth about the ponds. I grew up less than a mile away from the ponds. So, yes, it was party at the ponds. But when I was a child, you didn't take anything out of there. If you found something, it stayed there. It
Yeah.
belonged there. It was native land. You didn't remove it. The only thing you could take from the ponds was the water.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that you've said that. And I think, so what you're reminding me is that we also want to be careful about how we critique the non-native story. And it's important to critique that story or those stories. Uh-oh.
Probably me.
I fixed it. But so remember, different people's experiences or relationship also to this history can vary. And that's important too. My own mother talks about that, right? And so other people in her generation or in the generation above her don't. They took whatever they wanted. But for my mother, my grandfather said, you do not take anything from here. That's disrespectful, right? We respect the people who lost their lives here. We respect the ancestors. We respect the land. And yeah, the only thing you took was water. And she also talked about how going there was about when she would go places with her dad, as a young kid and like be foolish and loud and whatever. But when he took her there, that wasn't allowed, right? So there was a different way of, and for my grandfather, my grandfather does have distant indigenous ancestors, and that was really important to him and to the way that he related to these places. And it's really important to how my mom understands and I understand how we relate to these places as descendants of settlers and indigenous ancestors, really products of these interactions and these violent histories, but also family relationships, right? And so really thinking about those complexities, I think, is really important.
I think it was really, really difficult because, that was a place of celebration for many people. And for some of us, we were taught differently about what the Pines was. The same way we were taught differently about Father Rawl. And some respect and others, he was a traitor. So,
Yeah.
I know what your grandfather's saying.
And
I grew up with your mother, so.
Perfect.
Just up the road.
Just up the road, round the corner. But you're also reminding me, and I think it's really, so if you're familiar with any of these histories, the sort of American histories that were written in the 19th century, there's two threads of the way that they write about Father Rawl. And so I just want to, and we talked a little bit about this at dinner, there's the American nationalists, and not as much the locals, but a little bit, but the American nationalist histories talk about Father Rawl, and there are two stories. One, he was this great guy, he was loved by the natives, it was all hunky-dory until those god-awful English evil devils killed him. He wrote a dictionary, and he has, the dictionary is at Harvard, and they have digitized it if you want to see. They digitized it as images, so you actually see the page. It's not just like transcribed. So if you're interested, I think that it's public. You might be able to. But anyway, so there's that story that they tell in those books. The other version is, he was a traitor. He riled up the natives. He caused all kinds of trouble for the English, and how awful those frickin' Jesuits were. They sound like contradictory stories, right? They're total opposites. But when I read what those authors are doing, each author, and I looked at a lot of these, and there's two threads. Each author is telling an American nationalism story. They don't really have anything to do with Father Rawl. They actually have to do with whether the author was a loyalist to the British and saw the British as the forefathers of America, or if they were anti-British and saw the colonialists, the American colonialists, as somehow a break from Britain and didn't really see the British as their forefathers. And so even though those sound like contradictory stories, in a way, when I looked at a whole bunch of them together and realized, wait, they're actually just American nationalist stories, just told from different perspectives of the way that people thought about their relationship to the British.
Yep.
It was amazing. Yeah, here and then there.
I just want to say that the way your inclusion of your grandfather at such frequent intervals throughout your story, I think actually speaks to the power of storytelling in itself. And his influence on you, I think obviously it inspired you tremendously. And you carry that passion and are now inspiring us. And it reminds me that the stories one person tells can shift the paradigm for so many others, you know, how that reaches out. But I'm hearing your grandfather's voice, for you.
Thank you. That's really
honor him.
kind. Thank you. I had here and then there.
I was thinking again of the Jesuit priest. Did they know for sure that he died later on, or that he died at the same time that the Norwich people that died in the church?
Yeah, he died in the attack.
He did die.
He died in the attack. There's a lot of stories about how. And a lot of stories about how from Native perspectives and from non-Native perspectives. The men who were keeping journals, the militiamen, don't talk a whole lot about it, but I think two of them wrote that he was holed up in his cabin and shooting at them. And when one of them burst into the room, they had this sort of wild story about how he had like an altar boy that he was harming in some way, like stabbing him or something weird. So I don't know, right? There's a story that he was fleeing. There's a story that he ran in front of the church to take the gunfire to help the Native people who were trying to escape cross the river, right? And he died, in that story, he dies like at the foot of the cross in this kind of like really grandiose, and there's an image like that. Well, you saw that in the image in the 1855. There's an image like that also in the way that Nathaniel Deering tells the story of Rawls' death in the play. Right, it's kind of dramatic in that way. And then there's, you know, in some of the burning church stories, right, where he sort of lures people into the church and the people die in the church, he thinks he's getting away. And either the Mohawks kill him for being a traitor, or one of the Englishmen kills him, or what have you. It's interesting, though, that he ends up dead, because he was supposed to be taken alive. He was supposed to be taken back to Boston for questioning, but he ends up dead, and only his scalp is returned to Boston, because that's what the English did in order to get their money, right, is they took scalps. The English did. Patty. Oh, wait, sorry. I had a question in the back, and then Patty.
Thank you, Ashley, for
Sorry.
sharing your research and your history. It's enlightening. Help me understand a native daughter's contribution to the history. A Madison native daughter named Mary Calvert. Are you familiar with Mary Calvert's work?
Yeah, I know the book.
You probably know her, perhaps. In any case, one book that she wrote was really, even though it was sort of broadly focused on the development of colonial history and post-colonial history, she also goes back to Father Roll, and Father Roll particularly in her work, Black Robe.
Black Robe.
And so I'm curious about, your association with her work.
Sure.
And also, having read this pretty carefully and other stories, the mention of Bombazine is interesting to me. And I'm curious about your research with respect to Bombazine. And I think this is in one of Calvert's stories, is that Bombazine was aware of the attack, and that he attempted to escape by canoe, but he wasn't necessarily associated with the attack itself. He just knew it was happening.
Okay.
And then he was killed somewhere in the timeline there, in his canoe on the water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hence the name Bombazine Rips.
Bombazine Rips, exactly.
It's also Nanrantsouak.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so for the folks on Zoom who maybe couldn't hear that, a question about Mary Calvert's work. And Mary Calvert was from Madison, and she wrote, she did a lot of research. She even went to France, did a lot of research on Father Rall and his life in the world in this context, called Black Robe on the Kennebec, and I think was published in the early 80s, maybe?
It was one of her last works in that series. Yeah.
I can't remember. Back when I was doing my exams, I could tell you all the dates to all these things, and now they're just not there. Dates are not things I remember well. So that, and then also the relationship or the story about Bombazine, and in particular how he dies on that day of the attack. So Mary Calvert, she did some really amazing work. She's not a professional historian. She's a local who's really passionate about history, and I believe she was really involved in the local historical society. Really interesting. Her house is right across from my junior high. I didn't know her. But she does a lot of really interesting research. She managed also to to find some of Rall's family members, descendants, because obviously he didn't have any direct descendants, at least not that we know of. But he, some of his distant relatives, in fact, a whole bunch of them came to one of the Father Rall Days events in Madison several years, I would say in the 90s. It was a whole thing. But she did some really amazing history work, and it was really, really useful, really helpful. When I first read it, I'll admit I was young and hypercritical of everything. And found it really annoying how she romanticizes Rall and romanticizes everyone. But also she's a really interesting storyteller, and she's really passionate about what she's doing. And it is a story in some ways, from a perspective of the Catholics who really revered Rall in a particular way in their own relationship, and telling his story from that perspective. She also manages to track down, and I don't know how she did this, some of the missing letters. So Rall, as a Jesuit, what they do is they're constantly writing reports and letters and writing them and sending them to their superiors in Quebec, who then send some of them back to France. And there were some that were missing, and she somehow managed to track some of them down. So really useful material. And she's both, what I think is really, in some ways, really helpful if you read her work, is you can see the relationship between the research and the storytelling that might not have research behind it. And if you're not paying attention, that becomes, I don't know, you could be critical of it as romanticizing, which I was at first. But also now that I do a lot of work where I'm thinking about those politics, I actually really appreciate it in the places where it's clear that this might not have research behind it, so that I can see those distinctions. And I don't know how useful that is for everyone who reads her, but I read that several times because it was really helpful, and it also helped me to navigate some of the early histories, like Baxter's, pioneers on the New England frontier, which is just dreadful. You want to talk about romanticization, kind of like flourish on history, but that anyway, from a guy who called himself a historian. But I think it's a long-winded way of saying it's really useful, but also we have to think about her context, think about what sort of story she was trying to tell, and understand it as a blend of historical research and storytelling. So for Bomoseen, and Bomoseen causes a lot of productive trouble for the English. He ends up, unfortunately, for a few times in his life, they end up capturing him, and he's imprisoned in Boston a few times. And the Boston prisons where Native people were held were just, I don't know if you can imagine a colonial prison that holds Native people, right, in the early 1700s. It was pretty horrific. But they are often, he fought really hard for his people and was a thorn in the side of the English. So I really appreciate him, regardless of, So the way that I understand how his story about that day. So Bomoseen, from what I understand, didn't live at Norridgewock full time. He and his family lived somewhere a little bit downriver, maybe closer to what is now the town of Norridgewock, or somewhere in there. But also he was, from what I understand, or how I understand the sort of political landscape, was that he was a leader, a regional leader. And so, he would travel to the different communities. And on the day of the attack, Moulton, I can't remember which of the journals write about him, but they come across him and his wife and daughter. And mind you, they're coming from the south. They're coming upriver, except there's a point where they leave the river and go across the land, which is how they managed to attack the village, because they had never done that before. They had attacked the village multiple times, but from the water. And so they come across Bomoseen and his wife and daughter, and he runs for it. But he's not running away. He was trying to get a message to Norridgewock to warn them that the English were coming up the river. And he is killed, and so is his daughter, and then his wife is taken captive. And we don't know, I don't know what happens to her. But she probably saw some really awful things that day. In addition to her daughter and her husband being killed at the hands of the English. And so, he also, people had big families, so some of his descendants are still around. And some of them are part of the Bomoseen Land Trust. So, check that out, support them. Yeah.
You mentioned about prophecy, never really got into that. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you for that question. And I can share that story because I have permission. So some of the descendant families carry this story. In particular, Nanrantsouak Thoma's family, and I mentioned he's a tribal historian, Passamaquoddy Nation, and his family carries this story because they're the medicine people. And there's a story that there was a prophecy that the spiritual leaders, medicine people from the community had received a prior prophetic warning that this was coming. And they tried really hard to convince people to leave. And the Jesuit, right, who I mentioned, Jesuits spend a lot of time trying to undermine the spiritual leaders, the non-Catholic ones. spend a lot of time trying to tell people, no, it's fine, it'll never happen, they don't attack this time of year, blah, 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 right? And so that family, along with anyone that they could convince to leave, left. Some say a few days, some say 2 weeks prior. And eventually, end up elsewhere at Machias and then at Passamaquoddy communities, and carry that story to this day, that they escaped Norridgewock before the attack. And they tried to save people. They did save a lot of people. They saved a number of people who left before the attack, because the village wasn't as inhabited as at other times of the year when the attack occurred. Yeah.
So, my understanding is that the people that were so horribly attacked in the church were converts of the priest. Is that true?
Great question. Thank you. And so the question, thanks, Marilyn. Sorry, the chat. The question is, the people in the story of the church, were the people converts? I think this is really important to think about when we think about conversion. So yes, of course, priests, reverends, these different religions, they're trying to convert people. And they're trying to convert them in like the most way possible. Interestingly enough, there's a point at which Jesuits are sort of like, look, we're going to take what we can get. Because they're living among people. And also, one of the other things that's really interesting that happens is you start seeing Jesuits in some places, starting to politically try to assist the communities they're living among to push like back against the English or to do what is in their best interest. Because now they've been living with these people for a long time, and they're starting to see things in a slightly different way. They're never giving up their desires to convert people, but they're still starting to see things in a slightly different way. So yes, people become Catholic. But it's in some ways a both and. And so one of the things I think is really that he talks about, or that you see in some of these stories, is people are really interested in spiritual power and spirituality. And a lot of indigenous knowledge, indigenous history, as I've come to learn about and understand it, is it creates a possibility for a both and in a way that a lot of Christianity says, no, we have to have only one. And so there's a potential for, your God, your spiritual power is interesting. Let's learn a bit about that. There are some similarities here. There are some major differences. We're not sure about those things that you guys do. That's kind of weird, right? But there are some interesting things. There's some spiritual things, right? And so you do get conversion, but it doesn't look like the sort of complete totalizing conversion that, what the English were trying to do, what the Protestants were trying to do, and what the Catholics probably wanted to do. Now, they get there later, or at least they try really hard, right, with sort of the boarding school system, and we're talking about other history. So yes, there's a tension, there's a back and forth. Were those people converts? In the story, they're going to church, right? Are they doing it for his reasons? Are they doing it for their reasons? Are they doing it for a little bit of both? Sure, right? Yeah.
The reason why I asked was because I was thinking of, if it was believers, which that only makes sense, believers were in the church, then there probably were those natives that were not necessarily believers that escaped. And you know what I'm saying? If it was, I don't know, I just think that's what I'm thinking about. But
Yeah.
we were talking about that there was the erasure that was put out there.
Yeah, and so it could be, right, that, but not necessarily, but it could be, right, and there are the people who, in the Soktoma family story, that they weren't able to convince to leave with them, right? In part because the Jesuit undermined them, in part, who knows, right? There's all sorts of reasons, and reasons we'll never know. But I think, thinking about that tension, and 32 years of tension, actually more than that, because there was a Jesuit at Norwich before Rawl, but tension between, different people who had some sort of spiritual power or claimed to have some sort of spiritual power, like the Catholics, right? That there's a tension between them. Pat.
What about the whole thing about on one side of the river they were settled, and then they were settled on the other side of the river for a while, and which side was first? And I know they found ruins on both sides.
Yeah, this is great. So there's a story that a particular archaeologist has told that, based on archaeological research, that the Norridgewock village was on the west side of the river, what is now Starks or Anson. Originally, that's the historic or the sort of ancient village site. And then after the Treaty of 1713 and the Treaty of Portsmouth, they moved it, or the Jesuits moved it to the west side because that was New France territory, right? I'm sorry? East side, thank you. West to east, to the Madison side. Now, there's village space on both sides of the river, we know this. The west side of the river has a really big gathering space. They found what looks like a longhouse. It's a really big gathering space. It can house many families. It can house a lot of people. And you can understand how this is a place where people gather for various reasons. But there's a little bit of a trick here, is that the 1713 divide between New France and New England was not the east and the west bank of the Kennebec River. So that archaeological claim and the historical documentary claim don't actually mesh up. And this is, when anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists don't talk to each other, they come up with some weird stuff. Like, I don't understand why historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists tend not to like each other. But there's a weird something there. But yeah. So there's a question: did the Jesuits forcibly move the village, or convince them to move it? I'm skeptical. But also because a village site doesn't, ancestrally doesn't stay in one place, right? And if you have more people, you're going to spread out. And the planting fields are on the other side of the river, so and downriver. And so if you have planting fields on both sides, you're going to have homes on both sides. You might have a village center on one side. Now, which side did the church get built on? My understanding, and I might be totally wrong here, I'm just going to put that out there. I might just be wrong. But there was a church built on the Kennebec, I believe at Norridgewock, like in the 1690s. It was a small church. It was built by Gabriel Joyet, and who came and went. He didn't stay. So he would travel down the Kennebec and he would he would preach, and then he'd go back to Quebec. And he did that a few times. And my understanding was that Rawl was sent to the location where the church already was. So I don't know where the idea that it was moved in 1723 or 1713 comes from, but that is one academic story about what might have happened. Yeah.
I think it's so interesting, well, maybe it's just not interesting if you're an agricultural person, but corn is still the major thing
Yeah.
that's grown along the river. And not just in this area, but other areas of the Kennebec.
Yeah.
Like the bottom land right close to the river.
And it was such an important, and there's a moment in this time period in the 1700s, my understanding geologically, it was known as the Little Ice Age, where it gets really, really cold. And the climate's totally different than later and than now, but now we have global warming. But which was that it was the last place where you could grow corn. Yeah. And so Norridgewock becomes, in that time period, a really important place for relationships, for trade and food and sending food to families north. And there are skirmishes with the Mi'kmaq people over corn, and there's a long history that, is very complex that the English actually step into. And the English have no idea that they're stepping into it. But there's already, right, we often learn this history from an Anglo perspective as if this whole space was empty, except for maybe a few villages. But that's not, this is a vast, right? There's this really amazing map by historians Reed and Baker, and I forget the year, but the article is about Wabanaki military power in this time period. And they have this map of English stronghold power and French and shaded, and the rest as indigenous territory and like stronghold, diplomatic, political power, as well as homelands. But they're doing it from a political and military kind of lens. So they're talking about it as like, political power. But English stronghold in the year 1700, it's right, there's very little that they actually control. Now, if you read them, they think they control everything. They're very grandiose about it, right? But they actually control very, very little. And they had to negotiate because Native people had a lot more power than a lot of us had been led to believe when we read those histories or learned them in grade school.
I don't quite understand why you were saying that the village was not highly populated at the time of this. If this is, after all, August is when corn is harvested.
Yeah, so why are people not there? They had been at war since 1722. Yeah. So there's a lot of reasons people weren't gathering in large centers, right? The English have been, over the last few years, sort of roaming the countryside. There's a lot of reasons. Some people had gone north. Anytime there was an outbreak of violence with the English, people often would move further into their homelands and come back. So there's this ongoing movement. So when they do that in 1724, it's actually something they've been doing all along, and it's just the historians in the 19th century who tell it as if it were new and different. But there had been a number of people who a few years prior had gone up to one of the refugee communities of Jesuit communities up in Quebec. And some of them had come back down, but some of them had stayed there. And they would come back later. So there weren't as many people in the village that day, thank goodness. Yeah. But a lot of people did die that day. Yeah.
So we're 2 years away from a very large memorial of 300 years. Yeah. Is there anything in the natives that have any interest in commemorating that in a large way? You have 2 years to be able to do that.
It's a great question for a potential for collaboration with descendants, right? Not a question I can answer. But I do want to mention people have always and have been gathering and commemorating and building relationships with the place and with each other, and gather and remember that's been ongoing it's been ongoing ever since, but in recent years more regularly. But that's an internal kind of by invitation community kind of thing. And I think a couple of people from descendant communities have talked about it, have written about it. There was an article that they did in I think that was the Press Herald a couple years ago, with one of the descendant families, Butch Phillips, who talked to someone at the Press Herald about it. So that is always happening, right? There's a big question about, good ways to build good collaborations. I think those relationships are important, right? If you have good relationships, then good collaborations can come out of them. But if not, right? So some things to think about. Goal setting.
Ashley, you have been terrific.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.